Hi everybody, welcome to PCS 101. Welcome to our class. This is for Tuesday, the 16th. And I first wanted to draw your attention to the notes below where you can see what we will be doing for the remainder of the semester. And believe it or not, we are in the tail end of the semester. So today I wanted to talk about persuasive speeches, also argumentation and critical thinking, which is related to persuasion, because that will be your last speech. So what you should have done at this point is posted your second speech, the informative speech, and you should have sent me your outline, and I would have reviewed your speech and also your outline, and I would have returned feedback to you. For a few of you, I indicated that I was still waiting on your outline. So when I receive your outline, then I will review your speech. And it probably isn't going to be a surprise to you that today's attendance question is going to ask you to review the speeches of your peers and to send me privately via my email one strength and one weakness for each of the informative speeches of your peers. And I will compile all of that data and then I will post that, much like I did with speech one. Now, where we are is that on Thursday, our next class, we have our third quiz, very similar to what we did with quiz 1 and quiz 2, and I will have you view a sample student persuasive speech. And that means that on Tuesday, the 23rd, this is when your third speech is due. Your persuasive 15-minute when you are trying to convince an audience to take a position or to perhaps take action, or perhaps a combination of the two. And for this speech, I'm asking you to use 3 outside resources. And that said, I stopped counting after 3. You can use as many as you'd like. But as we talked about, outside resources can help to give your arguments a certain level of validity. And you don't need to use an audio visual, but as we saw with the second speech, audio visuals help the audience understand and remember the information that you are sharing. And that means that the following Thursday, which is the 25th, is when we have our fourth and final quiz. Keep in mind that I dropped the lowest of the 4 quiz grades. So if you've done well on your first 3 quizzes, you can elect not to take the 4th quiz. That's your decision. But I will be posting that quiz. And obviously, I will also be asking you to watch the speeches of your peers and to post feedback. And that means that we have one last class left on the 30th of Tuesday, which I had labeled as a catch-up class in the event that we needed it. Thus far, it looks like we are right on schedule so that we wouldn't need that last class of the semester. However, we don't know necessarily what the future will bring us. So if for whatever reason we can't meet according to our schedule, we've got that last class as a safety class. If not, we've got that class off so that we can prepare for the fall semester, which is coming up sooner rather than later, believe it or not. So in terms of where we are is preparing for the persuasive speech, probably the most difficult speech to deliver, and that's the reason why you're delivering that at the end. And I would argue that your job is not to persuade everybody in the audience to agree with you. That's unrealistic. It's to earn your audience's respect. And I wish we could do more of that as a country and learn how to disagree with one another. If we can't do it in school, we certainly can't do it in the rest of the country. So this is the place to begin. Now, you've got 15 minutes for that particular speech because you are going to be using outside resources. If you'll remember, we talked about outside resources when we talked about the informative speech, just in the event that it turns out that you wanted to consult outside resources, but you didn't necessarily need to. Many of you chose informative speech topics that you already had some knowledge about, so you didn't necessarily have to use outside resources. But it's particularly important to use outside resources when you are trying to persuade someone because that helps to give validity to your particular argument. And I'm asking you to list those sources on your speaking outline so that when you submit in your speaking outline to me, I'll see those sources. And again, I wanted this to be as applicable to the real world as possible so that you don't necessarily have to cite your sources according to a particular format, whether it be MLA, Modern Language Association, which is probably what you learned when you were in English classes, or perhaps the APA, the American Psychological Association. But you should indicate on your outline those pieces of information that an audience member would need so that they can verify the validity of the arguments that you happen to be citing. That's the whole point of it. And in terms of audience members, they probably won't ask you, but in the event they ever did, you should have that information readily available. And your topic needs to be something that can be debatable, as opposed to the informative speech where you're teaching us something. The persuasive speech is where you're trying to convince us of something. Now, of course, every speech has elements of persuasion within it. Your first speech, your autobiographical speech, the persuasive element was that whatever you were sharing had some importance to our understanding who you are as an individual. And your informative speech, the persuasive element, is that whatever information you were sharing had a certain level of importance to it, that it was worth our time and effort to listen and to learn. But the persuasive speech is much more than that. The persuasive speech is taking a topic that reasonable people could disagree about, not a fact, but an opinion. And I can't believe how both have been muddied in the last several years in the political spectrum. I always thought that was the giveaway question on my quizzes. What is the difference between a fact and an opinion? Until people began debating over facts, things that could be proven with outside resources and with science. That's not to say that science can't be wrong. Certainly science has been revisited and revamped, but at least based on the information that's available at that point in time, it is a fact that it can be proven through outside resources, not just an opinion, which is a belief or a hope or an expectation. So, as I've said frequently, we aspire to do better with our public speaking skills than many of our leaders. So, I hope that you take this into account when you are listening to the speeches of others, that you should hold them accountable when they are presenting opinions as if they were facts. Now, one of the things that oftentimes happens when students either write about persuasive topics or they argue about persuasive topics is they try to argue so forcefully for their position, they act as if no other positions exist. And I think that tends to weaken the argument. If at all possible, try to refute obvious counter arguments. Now, that said, you don't want to lose control of the speech, or if you were writing a paper, control of the paper. You want to continue with your particular position. But pretending that there are no other positions is only going to weaken your position. One of the things we talked about was how do you deal with hostile audiences, and oftentimes having a multi-sided approach or just acknowledging that other positions exist goes a long way to convince a hostile, or at least to convince a skeptical audience about your particular position. So one of the things to consider in terms of your persuasive speech is whether or not you've talked about something in your first two speeches that could be adapted to a persuasive speech. Another thing that you might want to consider is, have you done any writing or any assignments in the past? Oftentimes this is a very common topic for English 101 classes, to write a persuasive paper that could be adapted for the persuasive speech. Also think about those topics that you have some serious investment in, and they could be controversial topics. I encourage you not to shy away from controversy, because again, if we can't talk about controversy at this level, then we're doomed as a nation. But if you're not comfortable with controversy, you don't necessarily have to pursue controversy. There are plenty of topics that are very non-controversial. For instance, the eating well and exercise topic that I've heard many times. And the persuasive element is not to convince us. I think most people agree with that. But it's to change behavior, which is very difficult to do. And then sometimes it's easier to change behavior, to get somebody just to sign a petition because they want the photo op, or because they just don't want to be bothered anymore. And that doesn't necessarily reflect their true sentiments. So you need to think about, how controversial you want to be and what topics are of interest to you. What do you talk about with friends and family? What do you argue about with friends and family? Again, there is a way to argue so that it doesn't become vitriolic the way it has in our society, and particularly in the political arena again. And I think that it's very healthy to have disagreement. And again, your goal is to earn your audience's respect, not necessarily to have 100% buy in. But certainly, if somebody agreed with your topic before you began your speech, one would hope that they still agree with your topic afterwards. You would be doing the exact opposite of your intention if it turns out that they changed their position. So, that said, thinking about ways to convince people, and this is an inexact science. We could spend an entire semester talking about persuasive techniques and critical thinking and critical reasoning. And this is just a condensed version. And this was in chapter 14 about argumentation and critical thinking, but also about ways to motivate. And that was also in Speeches to Persuade at chapter 13. There are lots of motivational appeals, ways to encourage individuals to take action. Oftentimes, advertisers will utilize these techniques because, again, they're trying to encourage you to take action. So think about affiliation or belonging. Everybody wants to belong to part of the group. Or think about achievement, success. Everyone wants to be better than everyone else. And in fact, it seems contradictory. How can you belong to the group but also be superior to the group? But humans are not rational creatures. Or power, which is control. And think about car commercials, for instance, how oftentimes they will utilize these techniques. Car being a very expensive purchase, perhaps one of the most expensive purchases you will make outside of your education and your housing. Affiliation or belonging. Everybody else is driving this car. I remember actually the Saturn commercials, and Saturn is no longer in business, that car company, where they try to create this idea of family. They even have reunions every year where you can meet other Saturn owners, and this idea that you all belong to the tribe or the group. But you see this oftentimes with the number one product, whether it be a car or deodorant. Everyone else is doing it, so you want to do it as well. You want to belong. Or achievement, success. And again, car commercials are very adept at utilizing this motivational technique. Based on the vehicle that you're driving, there's a certain level of luxury associated with certain brands, and one assumes that the clothing the individual is wearing and perhaps even the home the individual drives up to reflects that level of affluence or success. Or even power and control, and I think all car companies try to utilize this, that you may not have control in your personal or professional life, but you do have control of your vehicle. You can climate control it. You can decide what noise level, what musical levels to have within the car. The car is basically your kingdom, in effect. And I've oftentimes noticed all of these car commercials happening on highways that seem to be incredibly deserted, which might be the case in Western Mass, but I can say that certainly is not the case in urban areas such as Los Angeles or New York. And oftentimes these deserted highways are surrounded by natural elements, trees, for instance. The idea of trying to link the natural world with something that's very unnatural, the automobile. So advertising can be quite insidious in terms of how it goes about motivating individuals, something that I talk about in my medium popular culture class. Now, fear is perhaps the most powerful motivator, but you need to be very cautious with fear because fear interferes with reasoning. And we see how journalists have oftentimes utilized fear as a way to get ratings or clicks or whatever the case may happen to be. And that, yes, we do pay attention, but again, we're not necessarily thinking rationally. So I do remember in the early days of 9/11 where there were conversations about duct taping and your windows shut to prevent against the intrusion of particles from a dirty bomb. And of course, that's ridiculous. Duct tape can't prevent particles from entering into your home. But you actually couldn't find duct tape for a while around 9/11. It was sold out everywhere because people were doing just that. So the duck and cover of the 1950s is also a great example. Ducking and covering is not going to help you during a nuclear attack. So There is a theorist by the name of Monroe who came up with the sequence of steps that usually occurs when you're trying to persuade someone. I think this sequence is rather intuitive, and it's something that we've been talking about really over the course of the entire semester as we've been talking about putting together arguments for our audience. That you begin by getting the audience's attention. And then for a persuasive speech, what you need to do is to establish there's some sort of need, or else why would we listen to your speech? And then you need to present some sort of level of satisfaction that you are going to satisfy that need. And then visualize. Remember the importance of the imagination and being able to use very descriptive language to help the audience see what it is that you're talking about. And then ultimately, if there was some sort of call for action, if you wanted your audience to do something, then you could do it at that point. Now, in terms of arguments, and when we talk about an academic argument, we just talk about something that isn't necessarily contentious, though it could be contentious. What we're really talking about is a debate. That an argument has a claim, it has evidence, and a reasoning pattern. And in terms of claims, there are multiple claims you can make, and the terms are sometimes misleading. A claim of fact, it would seem to be this is a fact. So let me give you an example of a claim of fact where something is or is not the case. GCC is a small school. That's a claim of fact. The question is, by what measurement? It could be considered a small school in comparison to others, but it could also be considered a very big school in comparison to others. So this fact can be subjective. Or think about a claim of value, that something is good or bad, and that oftentimes is suggestive. And that oftentimes is something that is subjective. Think about something like GCC is a good school. How do we measure that? Do we measure that through graduation rates, through test scores, through anecdotal accounts, some combination thereof? Or a claim of policy that an action should or should not be taken. I've heard this many times, that GCC should reestablish its sports program, and we used to have one. It was cut because of budgetary issues. And I suppose the question is, where are resources best used? Could we in fact be hurting ourselves financially by not having a sports program, even though it requires a certain level of investment, because we might be losing students and enrolling students who might be going to other schools that offer sports programs? And again, until you actually institute the policy, you don't necessarily know what the impact is going to be. Now, we oftentimes use reasoning techniques to make these decisions, and that too can be flawed. Think about inductive reasoning, where you are reasoning through example. Medical studies are a great example of this, where you use medical studies to determine if a particular medication is or is not effective. But we certainly know that medical studies aren't foolproof, and oftentimes there have been studies that have seemed to show one thing when really the reality is something else. Or deductive reasoning, when you generalize based on all of these examples. College leads to success, for instance, and that is a valid generalization, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's completely accurate for everyone in the world. It's just the majority. Or reasoning from sign, which is an observable mark. So take something like a sore throat. That's the sign that perhaps that a head cold is going on. That you have enough examples that when you have a sore throat, that's led to a head cold, that you can generalize. And there are all kinds of errors that you can make in reasoning, and we do all the time in our conversation. The idea is that we want to try to avoid them in an academic setting, and certainly when we are delivering a public speech. The hasty generalization, for instance, when there's too little evidence in order to be able to support a position. I see this happening all of the time around this time of year when decisions need to be made about which classes, for instance, should be closed because there isn't enough enrollment. And lots of variables go into making that decision, and oftentimes it's past history. But is it completely accurate to say that this class is not necessarily going to fill because it hasn't filled in the past? Are there other variables in place, not necessarily about the course itself, but about the instructor or the time in which the course is offered, that impact whether or not that class is popular? Or think about an appeal to ignorance, what we don't know. In other words, prove me wrong. So I can claim that I'm a Martian from Mars, and until you can prove that I'm not, that I am. Or think about the bandwagon fallacy, which is part of this idea of wanting to join the crowd because everybody else is doing it. I talk about that as the typical teenage argument. If everybody else is going to the party, why can't I go to the party too? And the response oftentimes is, well, if your friends would jump off a bridge, would you do that? I can tell you from personal experience that when your parent asks that, you're not supposed to answer. That's a rhetorical question. But we can move on to something like a sequential fallacy. The assumption that cause and effect are interrelated, that the cause of something is directly before the effect of it, which may or may not necessarily be the case. That yes, you had a cold and that's why you performed poorly on the quiz. However, it could be that you always perform poorly on quizzes, whether you have a cold or not. One thing I've noticed in the political arena, if things are going well, the politician in place will almost always take credit for that. If things are going poorly, the politician in place will almost always say that outside effects are responsible. Begging the question, rephrasing a question. In fact, this kind of circular reasoning is something that I've seen on our own quizzes. For instance, what is critical thinking? It's thinking critically. All you've done is restated the question. What is empathic listening? It's listening with empathy. Again, you've just restated the question. What is empathy? That's what you need to define. What is a demographic analysis? It's an analysis of demographics. Again, that you're just rephrasing the question. You're not answering. It's circular reasoning. The appeal to authority. It sounds impressive that an authority would ultimately have some knowledge. But when we talk about appeal to authority in terms of errors in reasoning, we're usually talking about somebody who is popular, not necessarily somebody who has expertise. Someone like a celebrity, for instance. So a celebrity endorsement for something that has absolutely nothing to do with their profession. So, for instance, an actor who happens to be endorsing a cell phone company. The idea is that the actor really doesn't have any expertise about cell phones, but again, we admire the actor, so we want to have the same cell phone or the same cell phone company that actor uses. Name calling. This one is pretty obvious. This is a schoolyard argument, or this is the schoolyard process of calling people names rather than talking about the issue at hand. It's the attack on the individual. And in fact, in terms of this, there was an article that I wanted you to read, and you can see that this is in the third section of our notes where it says read article, and it's from Diverse Education. And it happens to be about a story that seems almost impossible, but as I'm fond of saying, you can't make this stuff up. And it happened during a college debate quite a few years ago. What happens during debates is that you've got teams that represent colleges, and basically they travel and they debate one another, and then there are a group of judges, usually the professors from the two schools and perhaps some outsiders as well, who rank the performance of the debaters to determine a winner and a loser. All right, so there are two schools and they are debating one another, and things go badly very quickly. The debate descends into name calling and all kinds of vicious attacks. And I know you're probably assuming that this was on the part of the students in the debate team. No, this was on the part of the two debate coaches from the two universities. They had a long and sordid history with one another, and this was filmed, even though it wasn't supposed to be filmed. May this be a caution to you. And those professors have tried very hard over the years to have that removed from the internet. But once something has an electronic footprint, it's almost impossible to remove from the internet. So as of the last couple of hours ago, I checked and it was still on the internet. I was still able to find it. Whenever it's taken down, it just appears someplace else. And it's just a short clip of their debate. And I wanted you to watch that video as well. It's just a few minutes long. And that's on YouTube. And you can hear the professors insulting one another. At one point, one professor moons the other. Yes, that's correct. One professor lowered his pants and exposed them to the public. And the subject of the debate was a very controversial topic. It happened to do with race. And to make things even more heated, one of the debate coaches was a Caucasian male, and the other debate coach was a black female. And again, there was a lot of bad blood between them. They had debated previously. I'm not that interested in the specifics of the debate or who was right or who was wrong. We do know the debate was about racism, and it was a question of whether or not the debate teams were being evaluated fairly. What's more important for the purposes of this class is to see how two highly skilled debaters, after all, they're communications professors, they're debate coaches, they'd even won awards, could lose the ability to reason in a moment of emotion. I think I might have mentioned Frank Luntz to you. He's a very famous media personality who is oftentimes consulted by politicians and also private corporations as well. And he determines what language to use, what word specifically is most likely to motivate an individual. So he came up with, for instance, the war on terror, which is a term that we are all familiar with. And this originated from the war with Iraq, and he said that you weren't going to get a whole lot of buy-in if you had a war against a particular people or a particular country. But if you labeled it more generally as a war on terror, then this is something that could be applicable in lots of different instances. And who is publicly going to say that they are in support of terror? And by golly, he was right. That's just one example of the many examples of what he does for a living. And he's very skilled at it. But the reason why I mention him is because he's of the firm belief that people are motivated by emotion first and by reason second. And I think in many respects that's very true. And this video that I'm going to ask you to watch of these debate coaches losing their ability to reason and in a moment of emotion basically jeopardizing their careers. I believe the end result was that one of the professors, the Caucasian male, was fired. The other professor, the black female, was put on probation for her job. The distinction between the two had something to do with the different universities that they represented, and also the fact that the Caucasian male was the one who had exposed himself publicly, while the black female did not. And again, we can debate whether or not those were appropriate punishments, but that's not of interest to me. What's more of interest to me is how reasonable, rational people can lose themselves in a moment of emotion. And I think we've seen that over the last several years as well in our society. So I caution you when you are talking about heated topics to maintain reason and rationality and not to let emotion take you over. The same when you are consuming as an audience member persuasive or hot button topics. And today's attendance question, as I had indicated, and that'll be due on Thursday, August 18th at 9 a.m. on our discussion forum, is to please list one strength and one weakness of speech, or I'm sorry, not on our discussion forum. This will be via my email. I'm sorry. Do this privately on my email so that I can compile all of the data and then post that on our website. So this will be due on August 18th at 9 a.m. via my email. Please list one strength and one weakness from speech number 2 and that was the informative speech, for each of your classmates. My email being Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class with a quiz. We will continue on next class also with a sample persuasive speech and for you to view and to give feedback on. And at any point now, you can contact me for your practice session for our final speech number 3, the 15-minute persuasive speech with 3 outside resources. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.